No one at Draymond High expected their new principal to be quiet. In fact, when the announcement came that Principal Alden Rowe would be replacing the notoriously strict Miss Calder, everyone imagined another stern, clipboard-clutching disciplinarian ready to enforce rules with a scowl. Instead, on his first morning, Mr. Rowe slipped through the halls with barely a sound, greeting students with a small, soft smile that seemed strangely out of place in a building full of echoing chatter and hallway commotion. He moved like someone who'd spent most of his life watching rather than speaking, taking in everything with thoughtful eyes that missed nothing. Some students whispered that he looked too young. Others whispered that he looked too calm. Trevor was the kind of bully who walked as if the school was an extension of his living room, shoving lockers open, knocking books down the stairs, and daring anyone to challenge him. And a few, like Trevor Hannigan, the school's most infamous hallway tyrant, took his silence for weakness. To Trevor, the quiet new principal looked like an opportunity, not an authority figure. So when he turned a corner and found the man kneeling to pick up a fallen stack of orientation folders, Trevor didn't hesitate. He kicked one across the floor like a football, laughing loudly while a few students peered around corners, waiting to see what the new principal would do. But Mr. Rowe only looked up, expression calm, gaze steady, in a way that made Trevor's smirk falter for half a second. Just a half. Then Trevor doubled down, stepping forward as though expecting the principal to cower or at least flinch. He didn't know, no one knew, that Alden Rowe had spent 20 years working in the toughest alternative schools in the state before taking this job. He didn't know that this quiet man had broken up fights twice as dangerous, faced down teens twice as angry, and carried stories in his silence that made typical schoolyard cruelty look like a dull shadow. Trevor, oblivious to all of this, only snorted and nudged the principal's shoulder with a careless kick, murmuring something about new guy hazing. The hallway went silent. The kind of silence that doesn't belong in a school at 8:03 a.m. Mr. Rowe rose slowly. No anger, no threat, just an unsettling steadiness. And for the first time in years, Trevor felt the weight of another person's presence press back against his bravado. And yet, still believing he'd won the moment, he strutted off, unaware that nothing in Draymond High would be the same after that small, careless act. By lunchtime, the story had already twisted itself into 3 different versions. Some said Trevor had knocked the principal over entirely. Others said Mr. Rowe had scolded him in a voice so icy the windows frosted. A few said he hadn't reacted at all, which somehow made Trevor look even more foolish. The reality was stranger than all of them. Mr. Rowe had simply continued with his morning rounds as though nothing had happened. But in that calm silence lay a force no student could quite understand yet. When he entered the cafeteria, conversations paused as students watched him weave between tables, checking in on groups that rarely saw adult attention. Kids who ate alone, kids who hid their bruised confidence behind hoodies, kids who avoided trouble because they'd already seen too much of it. His gentle questions and quiet nods spread like ripples, and the mood shifted subtly, but unmistakably. Even teachers, who had braced themselves for a rigid new administrator, began noticing that he listened more than he spoke, observed more than he corrected, and carried a strange kind of authority, an authority that didn't demand respect but generated it naturally. Meanwhile, Trevor strutted from table to table, retelling his exaggerated version of the morning, expecting admiration. But the more he talked, the clearer it became that students weren't impressed. Some were uneasy, some were annoyed. A few even glanced toward the principal, as if waiting for something. What Trevor didn't notice, because Trevor rarely noticed anything that didn't reinforce his ego, was that Mr. Rowe had been watching him, calmly, patiently, with the eyes of someone who had unraveled 1,000 bullies far more dangerous than a loud teenager desperate for attention. When the end of lunch bell rang, Mr. Rowe approached Trevor with the same quiet demeanor he'd had all day. But this time, when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that settled heavily over the suddenly listening cafeteria. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten. Instead, he invited Trevor to walk with him. Just a conversation, he said. A conversation about leadership, choices, consequences, and the difference between fear and respect. Students watched them leave side by side, stunned. No one knew what was said behind the office door, but when Trevor emerged 20 minutes later, his shoulders were lower, his swagger softer, the hard edges of his expression missing. And when he passed through the halls, he didn't shove anyone. Not because he was scared of the quiet new principal, but because for the first time in his life, someone had looked him squarely in the eyes and understood him without flinching. The story of the bully who kicked the quiet principal would become something else entirely. A reminder that real strength doesn't always roar, and sometimes the quietest people in the room are the ones who reshape it the most.